I woke up to this deathly scream. Immediately, opened my eyes to see this faceless man standing at my bedroom door. He was screaming a number at me and was holding up a giant piece of paper with that number written on it too. He screamed it, and I was frozen and couldn't do anything. After what felt like forever, it went away. The next morning, I Googled that number, and what came up was police code for disturbing the peace. It was at that point I told my parents I knew I had awoken something terrible. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tattooed Preacher Podcast. This is episode number 47. Hope you are all doing awesome today. Well, in this episode, as I've been teasing in the last few episodes, going to be looking at some real life stories, encounters, experiences within the occultic world from some of you. I put out an Instagram story a number of weeks ago asking for anyone who followed me if they've had any experiences to shoot them over my way, and I would go over them and kind of dive into them here on the podcast. And so I got a lot of response from that, so thanks so much to everyone who sent me your crazy experiences. And so in this episode, we're going to be looking at two specific stories who got involved in witchcraft. Now, kind of similar stories, just from different angles. So one's going to be looking at witchcraft in terms of Ouija boards, and the other one will be looking at Wicca and Wiccan literature and getting involved in that. And so just what can happen when one partakes in either of these various occultic practices. So it's going to be a good one. These stories are intense. So if that interests you, you're going to want to stick around. But as always, if you haven't yet, follow me on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, at The Tattooed Preacher. Links to those platforms will be in the show notes or in the description. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please give me a sweet review. Helps get this podcast out there. Episode 47, real life encounters, experiences involving witchcraft from some of you. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. All right, so here we go. Now, the first story is going to be around the dangers of Wicca. And so for those of you who don't know what Wicca is, here is just a quick little summary of it. Wicca, also known as witchcraft or the craft, was founded about 50 years ago by a guy named Gerald Gardner. So it's a relatively new occultic practice, if you will. Wicca emphasizes nature worship and the reverence of God or goddesses, combines various religious traditions as well as Freemason rituals. The goddess is seen the god or goddess is seen as an energy source within all things, and each Wiccan personalizes their vision of the deities, making the religion highly individualistic. Wiccans believe they can draw power from mystical sources, ancestors, and angels. The core ethical principle of Wicca is harm no one, do what you will. And spell casting and magic are essential practices aimed at bringing about desired changes. Wiccans do not confess sins or seek forgiveness from deities, but admit mistakes and try to make amends. They generally do not believe in Satan or absolute evil, seeing truth as subjective. Wiccans also believe that upon death, souls go to a place called Summerland to await reincarnation, where they reflect on past lives and decide their next lessons. Some may become spirit guides, and ultimately souls are absorbed into the all once all lessons are learned. The Bible, and so this is a Christian podcast for those of you checking this out for the first time. The Bible strongly condemns witchcraft, warning against consulting mediums and spiritists, viewing witchcraft as dangerous and contrary to biblical teachings about God, humanity, and the afterlife. And we're going to get into more about that at the end. So, Wicca is a very newer-ish kind of occultic practice. It's an amalgamation of a whole bunch of different varying traditions. It's highly individualistic. And so there's a lot of levels, a lot of nuances to the practice of Wicca. And so we're going to be looking at one of those in this story. Here we go. And I'm not going to be using real names as well, but I'm going to read the story from one of my followers who sent this in. Here we go. This happened when I was about 16 years old. My parents were Christians, but I was a rebellious teenager, and so pretty much wanted nothing to do with it. At school, I met a girl. Her name was B. I thought she was the coolest person ever. We became pretty close, and I went over to her house to spend the night. And that's when she told me both her and her mom were practicing witches. They were Wicca. She let me have some of her books about it, and I took them home and started learning. I never told my parents anything, so I started chanting things in my room. A little while later, I stopped being able to sleep at night. Every time I'd close my eyes, I would feel a cold presence, similar to how you'd feel during sleep paralysis, but I was very awake. Could always open my eyes or move. These feelings started turning into being able to see things. One night, I saw myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring back at me with a blank expression. I then got up and walked towards myself and vanished into a puff of smoke, like vapor mist. I would hear my name being whispered right next to my ears. The hair on my back would stand up and my blood went cold. My dogs refused to come into my bedroom, which wasn't normal for them as they always slept with me in my bed. Every single night, I wouldn't be able to sleep. I could feel such an evil presence in my room, things whooshing past my ears when I sat up, breathing next to my face, things on my desk and side table would move in the middle of the night. I started telling my friends that if anything happens to me, it wasn't my parents. It was this entity in my room. The worst experience was in the middle of the night. I woke up to this deathly scream. Immediately, opened my eyes to see this faceless man standing at my bedroom door. He was screaming a number at me and was holding up a giant piece of paper with that number written on it too. He screamed it, and I was frozen and couldn't do anything. After what felt like forever, it went away. The next morning, I Googled that number, and what came up was police code for disturbing the peace. It was at that point I told my parents I knew I had awoken something terrible. They, being the Christians that they are, prayed over my room, anointed it with oil, and showed me Psalm 91, which I recited out loud every single night. For a few nights, they would come back and I would muster up the courage to loudly speak Psalm 91. They would always go away. Eventually, they went away for good, and I never dabbled in anything like that ever again and stopped being friends with B. All right, so that was story number 1. Couple things I want to mention before we move on is the first thing is just the fact that all it took was reading literature, taking some Wiccan literature, reading it, and then trying to act it out, trying to perform it. What that did was open up a literal portal, if you will, into her life and attracted a whole bunch of nasty, demonic experiences. Like all it takes is just opening yourself up just a little bit, just reading with an open mind stuff that you shouldn't read, and then looking at it and then trying to act it out. That's all it took. And it shows just the power that's out there, the fact that supernatural realm is so much more real than people want to think or believe. She said she started chanting things. Now, chants. Now, if you've been looking or following along in this last number of episodes on the podcast, in the Bible, talks about over and over again is enchantments, or this idea of casting spells, these verbal activities where you say certain sounds in specific ways with specific motives attracts stuff. And so this whole thing of chanting things opened stuff. It unlocked stuff. It creates openings, invitations for the demonic realm to come in. It's why this stuff is not a game. Because I've heard people talk about Wicca, oh, it's innocent. It's not super evil. And again, there's various nuances and forms of it. This is how deceptive the kingdom of darkness can be when you open yourself up to this kind of stuff. Something that can seem naive or seem light, seem innocent, seem fun, seem meaningless. Boom. You are face to face with a faceless man in the night. That's crazy. And I've heard over the last number of years, as I've just listened to other podcasts and shows talking about this kind of stuff, where people have had similar experiences with faceless beings that would appear. People call them shadow men, or just these faceless entities that just strike utter fear and terror into you. And all this stuff, just from literally reading literature and just starting to dabble into it. It's intense, man. It's real. And then I like how she ends it with Psalm 91. Now, we're going to get into this at the end after I read the second story, Psalm 91, because I've been listening to a lot of paranormal stuff, Christian, non-Christian stuff, for a while now, hearing different people's experiences and stories. And Psalm 91 keeps coming up over and over again in these situations. And it's actually interesting. Actually, no, I'm going to save that to the end. I'm not going to get into that right now. But yeah, it's just interesting. Psalm 91, there's something powerful about Psalm 91 when dealing with demonic encounters and experiences. So keep that on the back burner, and we'll get to that at the end. So that was story number 1. Now, second story that we're going to look at. This has to do with Ouija boards and the danger of Ouija boards. Now, again, for those of you who don't know what a Ouija board is a flat board marked with the letters of the alphabet, the numbers 0 to 9, and the words yes, no, hello, and goodbye, along with various symbols and graphics. It is used in a seance-like setting to communicate with spirits. Participants place their fingers on a small heart-shaped piece of wood or plastic called a planchette, which moves around the board to spell out messages. The board was originally marketed as a parlor game in the late 19th century, but it is often associated with the occult and paranormal activities. Critics and skeptics argue that the movement of the planchette is due to the ideomotor effect, where individuals make motions unconsciously. Now, the Bible, of course, is clearly opposed to this activity. So that's a Ouija board. Now, I've never touched a Ouija board in school. In elementary school, a bunch of my friends, they would all play with this sucker, and they invited me over a few times, but luckily I never did. I mean, I grew up as a pastor's kid, Christian home. Now, that doesn't make you exempt, but I'm just glad that the curiosity, and I didn't do that because I had enough. I had enough of my own demonic experiences and encounters without a Ouija board, let alone adding that into the equation. But enough about me. Here we go. Story number 2, Ouija board madness. So my story is to show a real-life example of why God puts boundaries in place for believers as a means of protection from all that is unseen. I just turned 30. I'm a wife and a mom to 2 wonderful boys. I live in Minnesota, born and raised in a small town where there wasn't much going on Friday nights, besides football or basketball games and lots of underage drinking. This is very common in small towns out of boredom, I think, and being quite of a distance from other activities that larger towns might offer young people. My mom and dad were strong in their faith and never wavered. They were committed to God and our family fiercely. They warned me never to try a Ouija board, told me that it wasn't a joke, but could have serious consequences. Growing up, I had quite a wild streak, and I suppose I had to learn some things the hard way in order to know the depth of God's mercy. I am totally 100% sold out for Jesus right now, doing my best to walk in a way that glorifies Him, but there was a period when I was living according to the flesh. Anyway, this happened the year I turned 16, so that makes it 14 years ago. It was Halloween night, and I found myself at the home of one of my newer friends. I'm not sure who actually brought the Ouija board along, but later in the evening we went upstairs to her room to hang out. Most of the group stared wide-eyed at the board and was afraid to use it, but there was a group of about 4 of us that did. And for context, the original papers published in the state of Maryland, where the first Ouija board was used, described the Ouija board as a way to communicate with the dead. But what people need to understand is that you are actually communicating with demons that are capable of deception at the highest levels. When we started, we all placed our fingers in the center of the board and said, "Hello." We asked the typical questions. Is anyone here with us today? Is there anything you wish to tell us on Halloween night? Things like that. We had read somewhere on the internet that if whatever spirit that is contacting you shuffles through the letters on the board very quickly or spells out things that make little sense, then it might be a spirit that does not really wish to be, quote, bothered, unquote. So you should end the session and put the board away. That is exactly what happened. I remember rolling my eyes at my friend sitting next to me that had been too hesitant to take part. See? It's made by the same people who make the game Monopoly. It's not real. As we were getting ready to call it quits, thinking nothing would happen, something did actually happen. To this day, I actually can't believe what my eyes saw. The person across the circle from me started speaking in a different voice altogether. His eyes started shifting back and forth so fast, and then rolled in the back of his head altogether. His body started shaking back and forth. Another boy that was good friends with him began to take action and tried to wake him up from this trance or whatever was happening. He kept slapping his face and shouting, "Wake up, it's you, it's still you, come back." The boy that was in a trance-like state then ran out of the room and fell down an entire flight of stairs because his body had gone totally limp. Thank goodness the stairs were carpeted and nothing sharp was at the bottom, or I think he could have been seriously hurt. After that, someone poured a cold cup of water over his face and he gasped and came to. He was so completely confused about why we were all standing over him like this and shouting at him. He had absolutely no memory of what had just happened. After this, another girl said, "No more. We're putting this away and never touching this again." And we all agreed. We then went on to the couch, turned on the TV. All of us too shook up to try to even drive home, so we turned on a movie to try to find some normalcy after those events. Except, it didn't stop there. These were the days of landlines and home phones before people had a smartphone or anything like that. I was sitting right next to the side table where a cordless phone was plugged in. About 5 minutes into the movie, the phone started ringing again and again. It happened on a loop, over and over. Someone told me to answer it and ask it to stop, and there was nothing but silence on the other line. I didn't recognize the number, and it said unknown caller on the caller ID. And one thing I found striking was that the last 3 digits of the number listed had the number 666. It was that very moment that I wished I had taken my parents' advice. After this happened, one other crazy and inexplicable thing happened. There was a glass decorative ball that was in kind of a holder on the mantle of the fireplace. After the phone stopped ringing, we thought everything was over. And all of a sudden, the glass ball on the mantle flew out of the holder, which would have taken a lot of effort. Nobody was anywhere near it as we were sitting on the couch across the room. The ball smashed into the wall and pieces of glass were sent all over the floor, in front of us. At that moment, I said, all right, that's it. I'm going home. I do not want to be here anymore. I got my keys and my bag together. I asked my friend to follow me home as I drove back to town because I was afraid something would happen to me while driving. He was kind enough to follow me back to my house. My parents were the strict kind and usually waited up to see if I was home by curfew, and I always had to do a smell test to see if I'd been drinking, etc. They were old school. Anyway, I made it home by curfew and they were already upstairs asleep in bed. My room was downstairs, which meant I would be all alone on the main floor all night because my brother had just moved away to college. I was so shaken by everything that had happened, and I grabbed a pillow and blanket and legitimately slept on my parents' bedroom floor. When my dad tripped over me in the middle of the night and asked me what in the world I was doing, I just said we watched a really scary movie and I didn't want to sleep by myself downstairs. And I never really talked about that night again. But if people joke about spirits or Ouija boards in my presence, I will always make sure to set the record straight. I also knew someone in high school that crafted his own Ouija board out of a pizza box as a joke one night. He grew up going to Catholic school and church, but didn't share any kind of faith, so he figured he had nothing to lose. After his session that involved some other kids from our class, he later drove home and found his cat lying dead on his front steps with blood coming out of its mouth. He always thought it was just a coincidence and then another larger animal had killed it. But I always thought it was connected, especially after my experience with using the Ouija board. All of this is not to glorify it or make light of it, but to show people that the spiritual world is real and we are called to flee from evil, not to mix with it. I've had to ask forgiveness for my part in this. That's story number 2. All right, so that's intense. And I think to me, reading the story, the most craziest part was the friend. Seems like the dude got possessed by a spirit, where all of a sudden he starts shaking, eyes rolling back in his head. It's like to highlight the fact that you don't play with this stuff. I don't know what does. Now, some of you may have tried Ouija boards, played with them, whatever, and that didn't happen to you, or maybe things happened and it wasn't this intense. But when you put yourself in a seance kind of environment, you're sitting around and you are trying to contact the supernatural realm, and all of a sudden some kid is literally being thrown around by a demonic entity. It shows you, like, you don't play with this stuff. And again, I've heard lots of people throughout my life and just even now make light of these kind of things. I even posted on my Instagram a couple months ago where certain stores are selling Ouija boards as if it's some fun little toy to give your kids. Like, it's insanity. And it's a device, as she said in it, and I think it was Maryland was the first state to issue them. It's a device to contact the dead. Now, obviously, you're not contacting the dead. It's demonic entities that you are contacting. It's demons. But the very fact that it's a known thing from a state level that you're contacting the other side should let you know it's not a toy. Why are we issuing these kind of things to our kids? Like, it's nuts. The more that I hear stories like this, and the more that I look into it and just look into the whole occultic world in general, it's like the more that I've discovered that so many people just don't. It's like, even though they know, because both of these stories that we read, they grew up in Christian homes. Both of them knew it was like, we shouldn't do this stuff, but that wasn't enough to not. And I think there's that mindset there, I think, is very prevalent in our culture when it comes to supernatural things. It's why the study of, or this obsession with the paranormal, this obsession with, all these ghost hunting shows. And it's because people have this, we are spiritual beings. We're not just meat sacks walking around. And so there's this innate desire within every person to want to have this desire or this inclination that there's more out there. And this is where, as Christians, we have to really step up and be like, yo, yes, there is a supernatural realm out there, but there's a right way to access it and a wrong way to access it. There's legal ways and illegal ways. And this kind of stuff, this is an illegal way to do that. But so many people don't really understand the negative consequences, the negative realities of what happens when you open yourself up to this stuff until it's too late. Get curious, investigate stuff, research stuff, or, let's go to a seance. Let's go to this kind of thing. And then all of a sudden a door gets opened and then they're getting attacked left, right, and center by demonic entities. Like, I just think there's just this, I don't know, this lack of fear that people, or this lack of real understanding of the severity of the unseen realm, that they don't really get till it's too late. And so in story number 2, as she mentions, all of this is not to glorify it or to make light of it, but to show that the spiritual world is real. We are called to flee from evil, not to mix with it. It's real. And if you mix with it, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. If you're innocent, naively trying to just investigate or curious, you mix with it and bad things can happen. Case in point. And so you have Wicca, you have a very innocent, on a lot of accounts, this innocent, non-evil kind of practice happening that's opens doors to the demonic, as we saw, where it's like, it's just good magic. It's just good spells. You get into that stuff, man. And then Ouija boards, man, it's a portal. It's like a giant portal that just opens up a gate for demonic stuff to fly through and attack you. That's what it is. So thanks to both of them for sharing their stories and letting me read them here. Now to close, I want to talk about Psalm 91, because Psalm 91, again, as I mentioned, it's like, as I've been looking into this stuff over the last months and couple years, it always keeps coming back up again when dealing with demonic things, when dealing with occultic things, when dealing with, exorcist kind of things. It's Psalm 91. And I've grew up in the church, man. I was a pastor, been to Bible college, and, read Psalm 91. It's a relatively well-known psalm, but I never really heard it talked about or looked at in this kind of light, where it was so uniquely, or it's been so uniquely chosen for these kind of situations. Now, it's interesting, as I studied Psalm 91 and kind of got into that, the late Dr. Michael Heiser, one of my favorite theologians and biblical scholars, the dude changed my life from a distance. And he talks about how Psalm 91 is actually an exorcism psalm. And if you do a deep dive into that, this is why it's connected to a lot of these exorcist kind of accounts, because this is what it was used. Now, on a first glance, when you read through it, in English translations, a lot of things are lost, and you have to actually get to the Hebrew. But there's certain words, like for example, in verse 5, it says, "You will not be afraid of the terror by night." Now, that word there, terror by night, is the Hebrew word pahad. That's speaking of a demonic entity, a demonic being. In verse 6, so verse 5, "You will not be afraid of the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day." In verse 6, "Of the plague that stalks in darkness." That word plague there is the Hebrew word debur. Again, speaking of a demonic entity. So all throughout this psalm talks about how God is our safe place. He's our shelter. He protects us. But it's not just talking about protecting us from these kind of generic, things like sickness or disease or plague, which we need protection from. But it's actually talking about the demonic realm, the demonic world, demonic entities. And this is why it keeps coming up in these kind of exorcism type settings, because it's dealing with these same demonic entities, which I find super fascinating. So I'm just going to close out this podcast by reading Psalm 91. It's powerful. It says, "One who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will lodge in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For it is he who rescues you from the net of the trapper and from the deadly plague," demonic entity. "He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may take refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and wall. You will not be afraid by the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day, of the plague that stalks in darkness, or of the destruction that devastates at noon. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not approach you. You will only look on with your eyes and see the retaliation against the wicked. For you have made the Lord my refuge, the Most High your dwelling place. No evil will happen to you, nor will any plague come near your tent. For he will give his angels orders concerning you to protect you in all your ways. On their hands they will lift you up so that you do not strike your foot against a stone. You will walk upon the lion and cobra, you will trample the young lion and the serpent. Because he has loved me, I will save him. I will set him securely on high because he has known my name. He will call upon me and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. I will satisfy him with a long life, show him my salvation." And so I pray that, speak that over you all who are watching or listening today, that you would indeed find yourself in the shelter of the Most High, that you will abide in his presence, his protection would surround you, guard you, keep you. But I also want to say, don't mix with evil. Don't play with it. Don't engage with it. Don't open up yourself to that kind of stuff, because as we've looked at in these stories and as we've looked at over the last number of episodes, this stuff is real. The supernatural realm is real. And there's an enemy out there who wants to take you out, who's very crafty, very deceptive, that has the potential to open up gateways and portals for the demonic to flood into your life. Stay close to Jesus, stay in his word, and you'll be protected. Well, that's it for episode number 47. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know any comments, questions down below about these stories. And if you are listening to this and you have your own story, my email is in the description below. Feel free to email me your story, because I'm looking for other ones as well as we get into upcoming episodes to share, to talk about the world of the occult and the experiences and encounters that people have with it. Have yourself an awesome rest of your day or evening, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Much love, and God bless.